Hey, how you doing? And welcome to Livewire Markets. I'm Ali Selby, and today I'm joined by Lumi Adisa, who's the Investment Director of Energy Markets here at Octopus Investments. It's certainly an interesting time to be discussing energy. After all, it's actually the last day of the COP26 summit in Glasgow today. So stick around, don't go anywhere. Today we'll be discussing all things renewable energy investments. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lumi. It's such a pleasure to sit down with you here in Melbourne, of all places.
Thanks, Ali. It's been such a challenge in here. Happy to be here.
Lumi, you've been with Octopus for 3 months now. In your previous career, you've really worked in kind of gas modelling, design and policy. What inspired the shift to working in renewable energy investments?
I've been in Octopus now for 3 months, like you rightly said. But before joining Octopus, the start of my career was really predominantly in gas. I actually came to Australia about 12 years ago to study my PhD in applied mathematics, and the core of my thesis was really, gas modeling using nanotechnology. But at the time, the key focus of the thesis was literally how can we capture gas using some of these, advanced sort of tech and nanomaterials. But looking back now at the time when I took on this degree, if I had a choice then I would have probably done it in renewable energy because the path in which the world's going, we really need to decarbonize fast. I actually got my first job to sort of build a gas modeling software, but in the same company, they had an electricity software as well. So when I got into the company, I ended up working as a sort of customer support in technical studies in electricity markets. And I got introduced into renewable energy, and what a fascinating world it is, isn't it? So that's really what inspired me to make the move into renewable energy from a software development perspective. And after I finished that stint with that company, I moved into the Australian energy market operator to help them build this integrated system plan modeling, which sort of looked at the gas component of the Australian energy market and electricity component as well, but putting them together in a single model to sort of look at what we need to do to transition and decarbonize our system over the next 20 years. So that was the way I made the big leap of faith into clean energy modeling and technologies.
As you mentioned there, the world is rapidly moving towards renewable energy sources. Australia really isn't though. Scott Morrison's really cemented his bullish stance on coal during the COP26 summit. He's recently released Australia's plan to reach net zero by 2050. What's your view on that plan?
That's correct. Yesterday or sometime this week, I think there was a report that said Australia was actually ranked last out of the 60 countries in the COP26 conference in terms of energy policy. And the plan that's been released by the federal government really centers around using technology, not taxes, to drive this emissions reduction on this net zero target. But the really interesting thing about that is that we already have those technologies. Wind and solar is already a mainstay in our energy mix in Australia, and we just need a bit of more sort of policy support to get the energy storage to assist these technologies in sort of providing this zero carbon future for us, because the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. So there will be periods where you would genuinely need to store these energy sources so you can use them when A, you have a lot of demand that's greater than what you're generating from the wind or the sun, or B, during periods when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. And I think with these technologies already here, even according to the government's plan, we should be matching a lot quicker towards this renewable energy future. And there's also a really important point that sort of gets missed in this whole debate in Australia, and that's the fact that despite the fact that we're blessed with so many natural resources, if it's wind, if it's solar, if it's hydro, a lot of countries really have just one of these. And look at Iceland, for instance, right? They're almost fully renewable energy driven just from wind and hydro water alone. And we've got all of this, but unfortunately, or fortunately for us as well, we also have a lot of coal and we have a lot of gas. Yeah. So, it's really a thing where our blessing is almost like a bit of a hindrance now for us to sort of move into this renewable energy future. And I think the target of keeping emissions below sort of the 26 to 28% levels by 2030 is great, but the government also says they want to achieve 85% by 2050. Well, to get to 85% by 2050, you need to have a stronger target by 2030. Otherwise, you would really have this big step change after 2030, and who knows what that would mean for Australia? Who knows if we even have that much time to sort of wait before we really take this leap of faith into the future that is already here.
Energy Minister Angus Taylor said this transition to renewable energy could cost taxpayers around $20 billion. What kind of energy assets do you think could really benefit from those funds?
Yeah, so I think if we even take a step back and look at what would happen if we did not make this transition, I think it will cost us a whole lot more than $20 billion, right?
Of course.
So you've got coal in a state like New South Wales currently supplying over 80% of the state's energy mix. And these are power stations that were built in the 70s. They all coming to the end of their technical lives. So
Yeah.
even if we didn't have the urge to decarbonize, these coal assets have to be replaced. They're getting old. So at the end of the day, the investment that you would need to replace this coal unit is not just from a sort of energy COP26 driven sort of target. It's just a natural mainstay of our energy system. We are running out of time to replace these coal generators. So if you look at COP26, that's just an accelerator of what we need to do. Even if the drive from some of the COP26 targets were in there, we still need to decarbonize by the fact that we just need to replace these old coal stations. And wind and solar are the cheapest renewable energy sources right now to replace this unit. So from a sort of economic perspective, this presents a significant investment opportunity in Australia. If you have 80% of your generation mix in your largest state that needs to be replaced, and you have abundant wind and abundant solar in the country, then that's just a natural incentive to have these investment pour into the space and allow the space to grow. But if we don't do that and we don't look to replace this coal asset, the cost of power outages, the cost of the impact on businesses that would not be able to run on power will be greater than $20 billion. So in a way, I think we should see the $20 billion as the cheapest path for us right now, because the alternative to not doing anything will be a lot more costly to the Australian taxpayers.
Is that where you're finding investment opportunities at the moment then, within wind and solar?
Yes, correct. So that's predominantly where we are looking at investing in the energy market. So we focus on solar, wind, and storage technologies because we recognize this opportunity that Australia has today to really bring in not just investments that can bring good returns to investors, but also just the right thing to do. It gives us a way to bring in sustainable capital into a market that also helps to drive the narrative in Australia.
Are we likely to see further institutional investment in managers like Octopus, or even in other in renewable energy funds, as a result of this plan and COP26 and everything else that's happening at the moment?
For institutional investors, if you have an airport or a toll road, those assets don't talk to each other. So you could build an airport in Sydney and have a toll road somewhere in Sydney in the same state, and they don't really have to be in conduit with each other. But the difference with the energy market is that a wind asset or a solar asset need to really talk to each other, because they provide energy at different times of the day. They competing for the same demand, they meet in the same price. So when you have, fund managers that really have a deep understanding of the grid, where the market is at, how these assets operate, what the impact of weather is likely to be on yields and returns in the future, that's where our core selling point is. We have grid experts. We're not a fund manager that has a lot of your Wall Street type bankers in there. We are, boots on the ground type of fund managers, where we really take a big step towards understanding what the market's doing, what the market needs, and how we can really foster this portfolio growth across all the assets we're looking and managing.
Australia has been completely slammed by much of the world for its, lack of energy policy, really. I'm sure most of our readers have seen the Times Square billboards. There's also been, ads across Glasgow. And then also, as you mentioned earlier, we've kind of ranked last on that energy policy. Where is Australia at on its transition towards renewable energy, in your view, and how does that compare to other countries?
It's a really good question, actually. Australia is right at the start of its renewable energy journey. If you look at how much renewables have grown, and over the last 4 years in New South Wales, again, the state that's got this huge dependence on coal, you have seen just a 4% growth in the actual generation from wind and solar in the state. So you're looking at an 11% energy mix from renewable energy sources that needs to replace something about 80%. So if you sort of look at that and you think, this 80% is sort of leaving the market in the next 10 years, it really tells you that we're not just only at the infancy stage of our renewable energy story, but we need to move a lot quicker in the next 10 years if we're ever going to replace coal or be successful at replacing coal at the lowest cost to consumers. But the second half of your question was really asking about where we are at in terms of our transition compared to other countries. There's actually been a report released quite recently that sort of says, amongst the OECD countries per capita, Australia is right at the top in terms of emissions and, the fugitive emissions as well that we sort of release into the atmosphere. The interesting thing about that, though, is that it doesn't tell the full Australian story, because there are actually some Australian states that are right at the front of the energy transition. Tasmania, for instance, generates about 100% of its energy from renewable energy sources.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they predominantly use water and wind. They've got some gas units that haven't run for a while, and that's the true beauty of Australia as a country. We have a lot of these opposite states almost, or states at different periods in their transition. Some states are right ahead, some states are behind, still trying to move the dial a bit quicker. And credit to the New South Wales government, they released a policy recently saying they wanted to halve emissions by 2030, which means we would pick up pace and we would move in the right direction. But the truth is, when you look at some of the stats and figures, it kind of does a bit of a disservice to the Australian states that are well ahead in their transition journey. South Australia is at around the 50% mark in terms of renewable energy generation. ACT is 100%, Tasmania is 100%. So it's really the coal-dominated states, Queensland, Victoria to an extent, and New South Wales, that really need to sort of move a bit quicker. And those state governments have put in policies now to make sure that they can accelerate this transition journey. And this is again why I really believe whatever happens at the federal level, it does matter, but the states have already made this charge towards renewable energy, and New South Wales is already really picked their camp, and they know that renewable energy is something that will be a part of their future energy mix, and they're doing everything they can, I guess, to move down that path a bit quicker.
What place do you see renewable energy investments having in an investor's portfolio? Are they, a growth kind of asset, or is it more of a defensive positioning?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think if you look at like the typical markets, like your bond and equities market, renewable assets are great as a diversification. Just because they're quite uncorrelated to these assets. And also they are built on the fundamental need for energy. So, and energy is kind of a good indicator, or a good correlated sort of metric with GDP. So as long as you have energy demand and you have a strong economy, there would always be a need for energy, right? And if the cheapest source of generating this energy is renewable energy, of course they're a defensible asset class, right? And with the diversification, like I mentioned earlier, to things like your bond and equities market, they are such a great asset class to have in a portfolio, because when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining, it doesn't. Those technologies don't care if where your bond market or where your equity market says, the sun's still going to rise in the morning. So I think that's a really beautiful thing about this asset class and the attractiveness of this asset class to investors. And like I mentioned earlier, with institutional investors as well, if you sort of hold in an airport asset or a toll road asset, a renewable energy portfolio is a great diversification as well to have. And if there's anything we can guarantee in the world over the next 20, 30 years, is the fact that we're going to need more energy, we're going to need less coal, and we're probably going to need more renewables. So it doesn't get more defensible than that. And with a country like Australia, like I said earlier, we are blessed with all of these great renewable energy sources. So it just adds to the beauty of this asset class and the attractiveness to investors, really.
This is probably the question that everyone's been waiting for. What kind of returns can we actually expect from renewable energy assets?
Yeah, it's a good question. But like we sort of talked about earlier, it's good to sort of look at some of the fundamentals that underpin this asset class. So it's the defensibility, it's the ability to provide diversification into a portfolio for investors. But the other real interesting thing is that for the operating assets within our fund, we are expecting, a 4 to 5% yield on them. And for the construction and operating assets within the same portfolio, we're looking at a 7 to 9% return on these asset classes within the fund that we are managing in Australia.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you today, Lumi. Thank you so much for your time. Before we clock off, I'd love to know, what do you do when you're not, working, analysing renewable energy assets here? What do you like to do for fun?
I actually enjoy playing soccer. But now, when I go out to play, I don't really recover as quickly as I used to 10 years ago. In my spare time, what I really mainly do is I DJ. So I do like making music and mixing music and really switching off and getting into sort of my groove when I'm not working, and just letting music take control and just kicking back and just not thinking about maths or analyzing markets or modeling or any of those really nerdy things that I enjoy.
So mathematical genius by day, Afrobeats DJ by night. How do those two worlds intertwine?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me that, and I think it's actually quite correlated. There's a strong correlation between the creativity that you need to sort of solve equations and the creativity that you need to make beats work. Yeah, right? Because at the end of the day, it's really frequency. You're matching frequencies of, two sort of different types of music or two different genres of music. And when you're solving a math problem, sometimes, the answer to that equation might be stuck somewhere that you probably would not see if you did not sort of open up your mind or your creative thinking to sort of be able to see where the solution to this equation is, right? So yeah, I think the creative thinking part of it really helps. In my downtime, when I sort of switch off, I still get the brain ticking by trying to kind of make this music and do stuff to make sure that you're not killing people's vibe, essentially.
Well, I absolutely love that there can be this kind of creativity in maths. Thank you so much for your time today. I've absolutely loved this interview. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ali.